Today's daf is daf Nun Aleph, and we're going to start with Lema Kitanoi, which is the end of the third line. And we spoke about Rav's psak yesterday that Yochayv Misa, in the case of an idolatry where he breaks a rod in order to worship the idol, because anything that's similar to what we did in the Beis Hamikdash is considered a capital crime of Avoda Zara. So in the Beis Hamikdash, they shechted, and shechting, I guess, is considered like separating, the head from the body. And here also, he breaks the rod. Lemeketanoish, should we say that this issue is really the subject of a controversy amongst the Tanoim? And here we get to a case of a chagav. Now, there was one particular kind of an idolatry in which they would cut off the head of a chagav as an act of worshiping idols. A chagav is literally translated into English as a locust, and it has apparently a head that's more visible and profound than in the case of other crawling creatures. So now, for the sake of idol worship, he slaughtered, so to speak, a locust by cutting off its head. Rabbi Yehuda Machayev and Chachamim Potrin. My la b'hakamifli. Shouldn't we assume that the subject of this machlokas is Demar Savar Ke'en Zvicha? According to Rabbi Yehuda, when he cuts off the head of the locust for the sake of idolatry, that's similar to shchita, which is done in the Beis Hamikdash, and therefore Yechayev. Mar Sovar, but on the other hand, the Chachamim are of the opinion, Lo Amrinan Ke'en Zvicha. In other words, Zvicha is different than all the other avodos. For example, Zvicha is kosher bizarre. And although the Zvicha takes place in the Zara as the first of the four avodos, but it's got a separate category. And it's called, so to speak, chutz. It's not pnim. And according to the Chachamim, the only similarity that would generate the capital crime of Avodah Zarah, the similarity to Avodah in Migdash, would have to be Ke'en Pnim, something that goes on inside the Beis Hamikdash, and you need that extra degree of similarity to the Migdash, which is lacking in the case of Shechita. Now, it seems that there's another element in this equation which is a little bit more complicated. That is, that according to the Rabbanon, you need a greater degree of similarity to the Mikdash. And here the Chacham make the distinction between Shechita and Shevira. According to this pshat, if, let's say, the Akum would actually slaughter whatever it might be, a bird or anything like that, for the sake of idolatry, then it would be a capital crime. The Rabbanan disagree in the case of a Chagav because they hold that that's only Shavira. You're only like breaking off the head of the locust, but you're not exactly slaughtering the locust. And the Gemara thinks now that the Rabbanan would certainly say against Rav that if you break a rod as part of an idolatry, that's not at all similar to Shechita in the Beis Hamikdash. So that breaking is even more far removed from Shechita than even breaking off the head of a locust. Lo, the Gemara says no. Tukuli amalo amrinon ke'ein zvicha. Ele ke'ein pnim be'inon. As a general rule, even Rabbi Yehuda would require that the act of idolatry has to be very, very similar to shechita. And therefore, breaking a rod for the purpose of idolatry is not similar to shechita, has no parallel in Migdash. But Rabbi Yehuda argues that if you do an actual shechita, for example, in the case of a bird for the sake of Avoda Zara, that's ke'en pnim. That's similar to the shechita that's done in Migdash for the sake of Avoda, and therefore you'd be liable as a capital crime. Rabbi Yehuda took this a step further, and he understood that in the case of Chagav, hoil v'tzavaro domel tzavar behema, because the neck of the locust apparently protrudes like as a separate entity, then when you decapitate the neck at the neck level, the locust, that he says is similar enough to shchita, and therefore you chayav misa for that act if it's done for the sake of idolatry. But the Gemara now is arguing against Rav that even Rabbi Yehuda, who is machmir in the case of Chagav, would disagree with Rav and hold that breaking of a rod is two steps removed from shechita, and therefore it would not be a chiyuv misa. Omar Rav Nachman, Omar Rabba Baravu Omar Rav, Avodas Kochavim she'ovdin osa b'makel. If the method of worshiping a particular idol is with a rod, then we have to make the following distinction. Shiber makel b'fonei chayev. If he broke the rod in front of the idol, then that's a full-fledged avodah zara. Now again, keep in mind that what we're learning now is Rav, because Rav was the one who held that breaking a rod incurs a chiyuv misa. The previous sugya, though, rejected Rav. But now we're learning according to Rav. So Rav holds that when are you chayav for breaking the rod in as an act of avodah zarah? That's only bifanel. That's only in front of the idol. And now it's a full-fledged avodah zarah, which means number one, that he who broke the rod for the sake of idolatry is chayav misa, saif, because we're talking about benoach, and number two, the rod is a chefta of avodah zarah, it's a cherem, and it's asur to be used. However, zorak makel lefanel chayav. In contrast to breaking the rod, if he throws the rod, no, I'm sorry, I said in contrast, let me scratch that. Similarly, I should say, in case that that instead of breaking the rod, he threw the rod again in front of the idol, then likewise, he's chayav misa, but here the difference is eino neseres. So the makil now does not become a chefts of avodah zarah. So even though throwing the rod is a method of idol worship that's normal, and for which he's chayav misa, nevertheless, the rod itself, the makil itself, is not forbidden because there's no similarity between that and migdash. So the chefts of avodah zarah is only chal with all its isurei hana if there's a similarity to migdash. So in the case where he breaks the rod, Rav is of the opinion that that's similar to shchita, where you sort of like break the head, and therefore it becomes a chefts of avodah zarah. But in the case of throwing the rod, although that's the normal method of in that particular idol of worshiping the idol, therefore Yechav Misa, but the Chefta does not become Osur because there's no similarity to Migdash. So this was Rav Nachman in the name of Rav. Now the Gemara says, wait a second. Amalei Rav Rav Nachman, I don't understand. Maishna Shiber, why is it that in the case where you break the rod, you say that not only is the idolater chayav misa, but also the broken rod becomes a chefetz of avodah zarah, it's osur b'anoah. The havile kein zvicha, it's similar to shchita, as we said before, because of the breaking. Is zarek nami havile kein zrika? Even when he throws the rod, it's also kein migdash. What does it mean, kein migdash? Kein zrika. Remember that the avodah in the migdash started with shchita, and then it went on to kabbalah sadam, haloch sadam, and then the dam was received in the mizrag, and then it was um, sprinkled or thrown onto the mizbeach. So here too, when he throws the rod, that's similar to the avoda of zrika in the mikdash, and therefore not only should it be chayav misa, which Rav said, but the hefza of the rod, which is now complete, it's a complete rod, should be asur b'ana. Amalei Rav Nachman responds to Rava, "Be'inan zrika mishtaberes v'leka." Okay, let's see if we can figure this one out. Just give me a second. In Migdash, when they did Zrika with the Dam, what they did was every Maisa Zrika required a smaller segment of the Dam. So therefore, it was impossible to take all the Dam, unless it was congealed, and then the Dam is possible as Zrika, but it's impossible to take all the Dam and do a Zrika on the entire entity. In the case of throwing the rod, argues Rav Nachman, the rod is whole and it's not broken up into its parts, and therefore it's not similar to Zrika. So again, because it's the normal way of serving that idol, therefore the Oved is Chayav Misa, but as far as the Cheft is concerned, it's not similar to the Migdash, and therefore not similar to Zrika the Migdash, and therefore it doesn't become a Cheft to the Surah. Elamei Ata, Rava rejects this. He says, Avnei Beis Markulis Bameye Osra. Why would the stones of the Avodah Zarah called Markulis ever become Osra? He doesn't break up the stones into smaller parts, and therefore that Zrika, when he throws the Avonim onto the heap of the Markulis, is not similar to the Zrika in Migdash. Amalei Rav Nachman responds, Aflu Kashali. I had the same question. Shaltiya the Rav Baravua, for Rav Baravua. Rav asked Rav Chia asked Rav. So now the question goes all the way back to Rav. Yamalei, and Rav answers, Nase kimegadel avodas kochavim. It's unbelievable. The act of throwing the stone onto the heap of Markulis makes that stone an extension of Markulis itself. Why? Because he's expanding the size of Markulis. Apparently, the avoda is to make this heap and then expand it. So again, if you analyze this mamish, it's like Brisker Lumbus. If you analyze the avoda per se, in order to generate a chefta d'isura and isra no on the stones, the avoda is not similar to migdash. because the Zrika Mikdash required that you break down the droplets of blood into smaller parts to do the Zrika. In the Evan case, you're just throwing the entire Evan as whole. But there's another element in the equation that's even more fundamental, and that is throwing the stone now engenders in the stone the status of an avodah zarah itself, of the idol itself. Why? Because his whole purpose in adding another stone onto this heap is to expand the idol. So if it becomes part of the idol itself, then it's asur b'no, not because of the avodah, right? The actual throwing of the rock as a form of worship would not generate a hefta disura in the stone because it's not similar to Mikdash, but nevertheless, it becomes a hefta disur because it is the idol itself. And Rav is not happy. He nichalamanti. This is okay if you hold avos kocham shalav kocham asur miyad. Elamanti omar achete aved tishrei deholo palcha. In other words, even if I accept your premise, Rav Nachman, that the throwing of the stone expands the size of the idol, but that's not enough to generate a hefta disura of avodas kocham because you need avoda. So you've expanded the size of Markulis, but you haven't worshipped that stone. And we have a mandiyama that holds ad shete avid, that it doesn't become a hefta avodah until you actually worship it. Amalei Rav Nachman responds, "Kol achas v'achas nasis avodas kocham v'tikrovus lechaverta." Whoa. I'm telling you, you have to take a course in psychology for this. What the Gemara is claiming now, it's so hard for us to understand these concepts. We don't have beans of an idea of what idolatry is all about. But in any event, what's happening is that when he throws the stone onto the heap of Markulis, not only is he expanding Markulis, and now Markulis has an extra weight to it. He got a little fatter. He's got an extra stone. But no, no, no. It's more than that. The stones that preceded the throwing, this stone that was thrown, meaning the stones that were there on the heap beforehand, are now, so to speak, worshiping that stone that you threw. So it becomes a nevad. So even if I hold ad te'avid, that it's not enough when you designate something for Avodah Zarah, it has to have actually been worshipped. By throwing the stone onto the heap, it has been worshipped. And that's called tikroves lechaverta. So here in the note, he interprets this Gemara a little bit differently than what I said. Maybe it's not really different than what I said. Again, the preceding uh the existing stones before he threw the stone now worship the stone that you added. Ah, no, again, I'm trying to get to the I could really skip over this, but just to get it a little bit down pat, he says that the thrown stone is now an avoda for the previous stones, for the idol that already had been formed. The only thing is, if that be the case, so why isn't it tikrovis? One second. We said it can't be tikrovis because he doesn't break the stone down into small parts. I think I understand what's going on over here. Ruvain, I shouldn't use Hebrew names. Let's call him Julius, throws the stone. And that stone is a worship for the stones that already existed. And it expands the idol. Marculus is now, as we said before, fatter. Now, John comes along and he throws another stone. And that stone is now worshiping the entire Marculus, including the stone that was thrown by Julius. So the Gemara now asks, let's say I have a whole line of people throwing stones. The last one on line, we'll call him Mr. Z, he himself is throwing a stone that wasn't worshipped. And even though his throwing of the stone itself is an act of worship, but nevertheless it's not parallel to anything in the Mikdash, and therefore cannot be prohibited as tikroves. Ella, what? You want to prohibit it as an idol because it was worship, but he's the last one on line. No one came after him to worship that stone that was thrown by John at the end of the line. Amalei, Iodatole, Zil Shakla. So if I understand correctly, what Rav Nachman is saying now is, Enochinami, if you can choose from, if you can identify from this heap of stones, that stone that was thrown by John as the last one on line, then take it and keep it for yourself. Do what you want with it. It can't be Asa B'Torah's Takrovis because it's not similar to Migdosh. It cannot be Asa B'Torah's Nevad because there was no Avoda on that last stone. Rav Ashi Omar, okay, that which I said before, I had jumped the gun a little. That was Rav Ashi, this new profound idea. Says Rav Ashi, Kol achas v'achas nasis tikrovis li atzmu tikrovis lechaverta. I think this works with what we call Gita v'yoda bon kach, some sort of simultaneity. What happens is that when he throws the stone, it's not only a worship for the other stones that preceded it, that are part of the heap, but it's also a takrovis liatzma, because since now adding this stone, it becomes integrated into the Markulis, then the act of throwing the stone is a worship to itself, to that very stone that he just threw. As the stone thrown becomes part of the idol, it serves itself as well. It's what we call self-serving. It's serving itself by becoming part of this enlargement. Tanan. So this is the Mishnah on Amud Beis. Now, Rabosa, I just want to tell you up front, there's no way possible that I can finish this daf in an hour. So whenever you have to go, you just go. That's all. I can't do anything about it. I would need probably 2 hours for this daf. So the Mishnah says, Matzah barosho ksus umos okelim. So on top of this markulis, he finds either a garment or coins or a utensil, harelu mutarim. So this is what's called noi. Noi means that you beautify the idol. And it's very strange to begin to understand how putting coins or a garment on top of the idol is like noi, but we'll see that in the Gemara as we go along. However, parkile anovim, if he puts a cluster of grapes on top of the idol, vatoro shel shibolim, or he's got grain and he puts the grain on top of the idol, v'yeno shmonim uslatos, which means wines, oils, or flowers, v'chol dover kayotzi bo, karvel gavi mizbeach os. And it sounds like the last phrase, anything the likes of which is put on our mizbeach is osur, seems to go on all these cases above. Bishlem, I understand yeno shmonu slatos. That I can understand ika ke'ein pnim. We do it inside the Beis Hamikdash, whether it's yenos l'nisachim or shmonim for the menorah or slatos for the nisachim. Nisachim, I don't mean niskei yayin or menachos. Ve'ika ke'ein zrika mishtaberes. And not only that, what's happening is that somehow it's similar to breaking something, which means it's similar to shchita. And apparently, again, I don't know the reality of it, but somehow when they throw these objects onto the idol, they break up into smaller pieces. And I understand that in the case of liquids. I'm not sure how I understand that in the case of solids. So we have both conditions fulfilled to create a hefzer de avoda zara. Number one, it's similar to an avoda in the mikdash of nesachim and menachos and adlaka. And not only that, the act itself of throwing it, because it breaks into small pieces, is similar to the act of shchita. But how are you going to justify the Isur and the Hefzer Avodah Zarah in the case of clusters of grapes and wreaths of grains? I mean, these are not parallel to anything that's done in the Mikdash. Lokain Panamika, or Lokain Zrika, or Sabersika. And not only that, when you put the grapes onto the idol, they don't break up into smaller pieces. And the same is true for the grains of salt, of the stalks. Kigon shebitzaron mitchila laka. Rabos, I tried to figure this out, and I was not successful. The idolater, Batzron, when he cut down this grain from the ground or the grapes from the vineyard, he had in mind for the purpose of Avodah Zarah. So I'm not sure, is Rava saying that the cutting down itself is an avoda? He says here he cut the grapevines or grain stalks in worship to the idol. And it's similar to Rav's shita of breaking a rod in worship, and it's similar to shchita, to breaking the neck of the animal. So again, this is a whole new breakthrough here in Avodah Zarah. We're saying that harvesting something is itself, if he had that intention, an act of worship. And as a Ma'aseh Avoda, it's similar to Mikdash because it breaks down, right? Again, you're not really breaking the grapes. I mean, you're just cutting them off where they grow, but somehow that's considered an act of shvira, which according to Rav is similar to shchita. Om Rabbi Avo, Om Rabbi Yochanan, Minayin lizovech behema balas mum lavodas kochavim shu potur. Right, we're saying that shchita for the sake of idolatry is similar to shchita for the sake of avodas Hashem, but if the animal is a balas mum, in which case it's completely mufka from avoda on the mizbeach, therefore he's potter. How do we know this? Says Rabbi Yochanan, we derive from a pasuk shenemar zovech lelohim yecharam bilti lashem levada. So we're talking about zvicha, which is shchita, and he did it for these false gods, and it has to be destroyed. It's a cheftev avodah zarah. Lo asra Torah ela ke'ein pnim. Right, so it says Bilti Lashem Levado. This is an action of Zvicha that you can only do for Hashem. So that which is similar to Shchita and could be and would be done as an avoda, that's a chiv avodas kochavim. But in the case of a balas mum, clearly it's mufka from the mizbeach. Avi Bei Rav, Rav is not so satisfied with this. B'mai, what kind of a blemish are we talking about? Ilema bidokin sheba'ayin, which is translated here as cataracts in the eye. Okay, so now we get into heavy kudshim. It's just so much here, every line in the Gemara. What happens if you have an animal that at the moment you consecrated it, even though it had a blemish, it could still be part of the avoda, but when you actually do the shechita, it's already impossible to be part of an avoda. Hashtal b'nei Noach chazia legavoa b'bama didhu. The goyim, as opposed to the Jews, have an avoda that we cannot have, and that's an avoda in bama. We also had an avoda in a private altar, but only during certain periods of time. Once the Migdash or the Mishkan was designated, then there's an Iser bama. The goyim, though, have a possibility of offering a sacrifice on a bama, which we don't have. Now, a balas mum is only possible in mizbeach, but not possible for a bama. And therefore, avodas kochav miboy, for sure, in this case of a cataract in the eye of an animal, although it's a balas mum, nevertheless it could be brought by the akum on a bama. And if that be the case, even though today, let's say, there's an Isur Bama, so you couldn't bring this Balas Mum on the Mizbeach, but nevertheless, at one time in history, you could have brought it on the Mizbeach when there was a Heter Bamos. And therefore, for sure, if the guy were to bring this Balas Mum on his Bama, he would definitely be Chayav. So what we have to find in order to justify Rabbi Yochanan's statement that a balas mum in a case of idolatry is potter, we would have to find a case where it would never be roy, even for a bama for a ben Noach. Ela b'mechusar eva. Let's say the animal doesn't have a cataract in its eye, but it's missing an eye. Kid Rabbi Elazar, Diamar Rabbi Elazar, minay l'mechusar eva shu asur libnei Noach. And now we're going to get into heavy drushes here. Pasuk here, pasuk there. It's very complicated. So again, we're looking for a carbon, an animal, which even for Ben Noach on a bama would be prohibited, and that, according to Rabbi Lazar, would fit into the category of mechusar aver if it's missing a limb. And we're going to go into a whole pilpul now about Noach. When Noach brought the animals into the teva, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted those animals, ostensibly, I mean, the Gemara is going to change its mind, but ostensibly, these animals, when Noach would leave the teva, would be brought as karbanos. So therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu instructed Noach only to bring animals into the teva that could be used as karbanos. Shenemar mikol achai mikol abasa shnayim mikol. So there are two words in this pasuk which are superfluous. Mikol hachai. And the assumption is Hashem didn't have to tell Noah to bring in, don't bring in any corpses, dead animals into the ark. So what's Mikol Chai? What's the emphasis here from all living creatures? Amra Torah, the Torah is telling Noah, Havei behema shechayim roshe evarim shalom. Now it's all the evarim are alive. Kol Chai. Don't take into the teva an animal that's missing one of its limbs. Again, there's a whole discussion why it's called the tips of the limbs. I'm not going to get into that now. So the Gemara says you're deriving this from Mikol Chai. Hai Mikol Chai mi boile lemute treifa. So again, if we could keep a scorecard here, we'd need a whiteboard here. The final conclusion of this Gemara is that Mikol Chai is going to exclude a mechusar aver. However, the Gemara is going to go through a whole pilpul now that I need Mikol Chai to exclude a tray for an animal that's going to die. In fact, the Gemara is going to reject that because we're going to derive the inacceptability of a treifa from a different pasuk, me'itach. But right now the Gemara thinks we have to derive it from Mikol Achai, and therefore we cannot use Mikol Achai to exclude Mechusar Ever. Hi, Mikol Achai mi lemute treifa. And the Gemara says, Milahachios nafka. Right, what did the pasuk say? The pasuk said, Umikol Achai, Mikol Abasa, Shnayim Mikol. And then it says, Lahachil Zara. Now the Gemara is going to go into a whole pilpul back and forth about a treifa, an animal that's going to die. So it's obviously a very sick animal. Can it reproduce? So the Gemara says, you're going to exclude a treifa from the pasuk Lahachil Kol Chai, Lahachil Zara. That makes sense if you assume that a treifa cannot procreate. But but if you hold like the other mandiyoma that even a treifa has the capacity to procreate, Michael and Maimon, then the pasuk lahachio Zara could not exclude treifa. Omar Kra, the Gemara says itach. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Noach, take the animals with you, and the extra word itach with you means similar to you. Itach bedomin lecha to exclude a treifa. Meaning that Noach is certainly not a treifa, and therefore Itach tells me that he should not bring the animals Itach with you if they're a treifa. So therefore I have the pasuk Mikol Chai now becomes free to derive the conclusion that Mechusar Aver is excluded as a carbon for a Ben Noach. Frek the Gemara Vidilman, let's be argumentative. Vidilman Noach Gufei Treifa Havi. Maybe Itoch is not coming to exclude a treifa because Noach himself was a treifa. And he was says Tamim Ksiv. Dilmak Tamim Bidrachav. Tzadik Ksiv Bey. So therefore Tamim means that he's not a treifa, he's perfectly healthy. Dilmak Tamim Bidrachav. Maybe Tamim refers to his character traits, and Tzadik B'Maisav and his actions. So we still don't know that Tamim means that Noach, by definition, was not a treifa. When it says Lo Matzis Amrit to Noach Gufi Treifa, that possibility that Noach himself was treifa, you should reject it outright. Disak that Noach treifa havi Omole Rachmana Dikavose Ayil. And now the Torah is saying Itoch. You're a treifa, so the animals that you take into the teva should be similar to you, and they should also be treifos. Shlemim lo tile, but an animal that's healthy, don't take into the teva. Impossible. So now we go back to our premise that Itoch is telling us that since Noach was not a treifa, the animals that he brings into the teva have to be dumya, have to be similar to Itoch, and they're not treifos. Is hashdu nafka mi Itoch. Is now lahachio Zara lomali. Again, this is not really relevant to our sugya, because once we already excluded a treifa from itoch, then certainly kol hachai is coming to exclude and to disqualify a mechusar ever. But once the Gemara already said that itoch teaches me to exclude a treifa, then what do we do? Lachio Zara lomali ime itoch. If I only had the possible itoch hava mina litzav sobi alma, maybe the reason why the Torah commands Noach to bring in animals into the teva has nothing to do with procreation and keeping the world going with the animals procreating. No, no, no. It's just for camaraderie, that Noach should have something to do while he's in the teva for 120. What's he going to do there? He needs like companionship. So it's like people like a dog. You know what I mean? So Vafilu zaken, vafilu soros, even an animal that cannot procreate would be allowed to go into the teva, and itoch is only interpreted to mean camaraderie. No, that maybe it's true that the animals would be companions, but that's not why they were taken into the teva. The primary purpose of taking the teva is to procreate. So the bottom line, as we leave this sugya, is that from Mikol Hachai we derive that Mechusar Ever is possible. And therefore, if an idol worshiper takes a Mechusar Ever, an animal that doesn't have an eye or any other limb that's missing, then it would be potter. There would be no, to say that there would be no Hefzer Disura because it's not similar to Migdash. There could be no Mechusar Ever brought in the Mikdash. Now we said that the way that they normally worshipped the Markulis is by throwing a stone. He went in and he shechted an animal for the sake of idolatry for Markulis. And yet Rabbi Elazar says Yechayah. In other words, the fact that he did an avoda for the purpose of worship, and that avoda would be done in the Mikdash, that in and of itself is sufficient to be mechayev in misa, despite the fact that that's not the normal way that this idol is worshipped. Shenemar v'lo yizbechu odes ivcheim laseirim. And this pasuk is apparently totally superfluous. We have another, right? We have many psukim that tell us that you're not allowed to worship an idol. Im eno inyula kedarka, tichsiv eicha yavdu agoyim ha'eles Eloheihem, which means kedarka, is tnei linyan shalo kedarka. And again, when you chayev for a sacrifice that's shalo kedarka, that's not the way it's, there are no stones being thrown here. That's only because it's similar to the avodah of the Mikdash, and therefore you're chayev. Frek the Gemara, v'ala hachi hu diasa? Are you telling me that I need the pasuk of lo yizbechu odes ivcheim l'seirim to teach me a case where he duplicated an act of an avodah in the Mikdash for the sake of idolatry? I need it for the halacha of a brisa.